Welcome to episode 19 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design. If this is your first Redesigning Cities, check out our diverse and fascinating previous episodes on our website, YouTube channel, and most podcast platforms. And you really can see we've got a lot of really great topics. So before we start today's discussion, I want to encourage you to join us on April 14th for episode 20, Redesigning Cities to Tackle Structural Racism. Raphael Bostic, President and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, will share the efforts he and his staff are making to link community development and economic policy to racial justice. He'll discuss these efforts with Catherine Ross, Regents Professor of City Planning and Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech. I'm really excited about this one. But I'm also really excited about today's episode, Redesigning Cities for a Tele-Everything World. How might we leverage the world of telework, teleeducation, telemedicine to even the playing field between rich and poor people and places? As a little April Fool's joke on myself today, I thought that in addition to being your host, today I'll also be presenter and interviewer in conversation with Chris Nelson and Debra Lam. Now, before I introduce all of us, I want to encourage all of you to post questions throughout the talk in the Q&A on the right side of your screen. You're welcome to use the event chat for comments and saying hi to friends, but we'll only be moderating the Q&A for actual questions. Please like questions from others that you would especially like to see answered. So I'm delighted that Chris Nelson has come back to Georgia Tech, at least virtually. Arthur Chris Nelson is Professor of Urban Planning and Real Estate Development at the University of Arizona. Chris has spent his career pioneering jobs housing balance, innovative methods of public facility finance, evidence-based smart growth, and demographic analysis for long-range planning. He's the author of more than 20 books and 300 other published works. And you'll soon see why I invited him to have this conversation with me. Debra Lam, you'll also see why I've asked her to moderate Q&A and interrogate Chris and me about Tele-Everything. Debra is the founding director of the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation and leads smart communities and urban innovation work at Georgia Tech. She founded the Georgia Smart Community Challenge, the first statewide effort in the nation that empowers communities of all sizes to become smarter. Prior to this, she served as Pittsburgh's inaugural Chief of Innovation and Performance. She's received various awards, including being named one of the 100 most influential people in digital government by Apolitical. Now, in addition to hosting this series and teaching urban design, my research focuses on retrofitting suburbia. I maintain the world's only database that tracks what I deem to be successful examples where dead malls, dying office parks, and other parking lot-dominated properties have been retrofitted into more sustainable places, more just, more resilient, all the good things. June Williamson and I have co-authored 2 books on the subject. The latest, Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Strategies for Urgent Challenges, was released just this past January. And I'll present some teaser projects from it in today's talk. And I hope you'll understand why I think it's essential to start planning for the future we want and not the one we might otherwise get stuck with in a tele-everything world. So I'm going to start presenting. As more of the population gets vaccinated, there's more and more talk about what the pandemic's legacy will be on the built environment. Is this the end of both downtown office towers and suburban shopping malls? Manhattan's population decreased 13% during the pandemic, while suburban Long Island's Suffolk County increased 2%. Is this indicative of a long-term trend of urban migrants out to the burbs? Or will patterns return to an kind of accelerated, quote unquote, normal post-COVID-19? I don't have a more powerful crystal ball than any of you, but I certainly hope we don't return to the normal of increasingly unaffordable, gentrified cities and diverse but highly segregated suburbs. The suburbs were never as uniformly white or single-family home residential as the 1950s sitcom stereotype. Since then, suburbia has dramatically diversified uses and people. Today, substantially more immigrants and people of color live in the suburbs than in cities. But generally, they're not living in the same suburbs as the more affluent, whiter population groups. Still, suburbs are where the majority of American people and jobs are. But the middle class is shrinking. And the suburbs are also where the most poverty, obesity, and chronic loneliness are. And, as many of us have long recognized, they're responsible for the most household carbon emissions, most of it from driving. Today, I want to propose that one of the most significant legacies of the pandemic impacting how we shape our future built environment will be the tele-everything world. And I'll argue that suburbia has both the most to lose and possibly the most to gain from a tele-everything world. Since the pandemic started, we're spending 25% more time online. According to a study that oddly counted 31-hour days, the average US adult is spending a pretty horrendous 16 hours a day online. I thought it was only me. And while the current impact of telework, teleeducation, online shopping, and socializing have been highly inequitable, caused tremendous death and stress, and devastated the social and economic life of our cities, what might we see in the future? We might see the kind of sci-fi dark side. You know, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, but I can't help but wonder whether the continued expansion of, will online shopping continue after the small business relief funds run out? I expect so. Are we going to see the loss of main streets and small businesses? Are we going to see kind of the future that the 2008 film Wall-E proposed of an automated, unhealthy world owned by the by and large company? I mean, this was the film. If you haven't seen it, it gives us a very dark kind of image of the by and large company takes over the world, gives everyone the right to spend. The world gets completely covered in unrecycled trash and refuse, and humans are transported to Starliner cruise ships out in space, where they live on hovercrafts that advertise endless sodas and snacks. It was a pretty memorable image right, for those of us who saw the film. Today, autonomous vehicles are on the horizon, and probably as close as we'll get to teleportation. So it's a stretch, but I'm including them in my speculations on the tele-everything world. Will autonomous vehicles be our version of the Wall-E hover chairs where occupants are bombarded with advertisements? In a world where rich and poor are increasingly divided, I especially worry about what poor communities that can't afford to maintain their streets to the standards required by AVs, how are they going to compete? Will TNCs, as has been reported, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, or now Waymo and Ford and others, offer to buy their public streets in exchange for exclusive AV rights and advertising? I hope not, but currently, AV concept cars are depicted as the ultimate in luxury, leather bedrooms on wheels, while AV shuttles that offer shared rides are kind of derided as toasters on wheels. But if everyone in suburbia simply swaps out their private regular car for a private autonomous car, we are very likely to see dramatic increases in zero passenger trips and trips by those too young or disabled to currently drive. This is predicted to easily double congestion, further degrade the public realm, and give those who can even more reason to flee existing communities and sprawl to the hills. Why fix struggling places if you can just tune them out? In this dystopic vision, and I know I'm exaggerating, the legacy of the pandemic is fear. Fear of the virus, fear of strangers, fear of cities. The car becomes our personal protective equipment. In this photo of Easter services at a suburban church parking lot in Atlanta last year, kind of shows the priest essentially praying and blessing the cars in the parking lot. Now, I know I'm being hyperbolic, but I want to contrast that dark vision with another possibility that reverses the outcomes. I'll start with a little story. In the early days of the internet in the 1990s, I was teaching at MIT. My computer geek friends seriously believed we don't need cities anymore. Life online is so much more empowering. I have way more social life and friends and vibrant, exciting conversations. And that was a very broadly accepted kind of logic in the 90s. But what happened? The more time we spent online, the more that cities bloomed. In fact, the 2000s, we saw cities that had not seen population growth in 50, 60, 70 years suddenly were popular again. In fact, many cities have become so successful that several are now ludicrously expensive. So I think, I'm proposing, I don't know, but I think that the more time we spend on screen in the tele-everything world, the more we'll crave that our off-screen time be spent building community in really great urbanism. Beautifully designed public spaces that feed our human need to see and be around other people and build the kind of localism and trust that makes cities function well. The upper rendering here is from very tech-savvy Sidewalk Labs, and it's from their failed Quayside project for Toronto. They also believed that the tele-everything world called for a vibrant public realm, but they missed the need, or at least the means, to build trust. Now, I hope that as tele-everything becomes more ubiquitous, that in-person services, just like in-person places, will become more valued. Give us those experience, the actual in-person personal touch that we can't get online. Our teachers, healthcare workers, hospitality, food services, artists, and other essential workers The majority of them women and people of color deserve no less. So what I want us to work on is the potential for Tele-Everything to even the playing field between rich and poor places and the services that they offer. As schools reopen, those in disadvantaged or remote neighborhoods might partner local teachers with more specialized teachers that can zoom into classrooms that otherwise couldn't afford or couldn't offer advanced instruction. Similarly, telemedicine can dramatically improve access to healthcare, and it's happening. Housing costs have typically been significantly impacted by proximity to good schools, jobs, and healthcare. Now that we're figuring out how to deliver those goods remotely, it evens the playing field somewhat. It enables more households to choose to live in more affordable, more convenient locations, while at the same time dampening demand for excessive housing costs in cities. So, in my admittedly utopic vision, the legacy of the pandemic, instead of fear, is access and connection and building trust. Access to both the vast opportunities provided by telenetworking and access to each other in great public spaces. This is a vision of a more equitable, polycentric metro with more urbanism, not less, but it's just more sprinkled around. What this adds up to is a unique opportunity to take advantage of Tele-Everything, to retrofit our physical surroundings to combat isolation and inequity everywhere, in cities, suburbs, and rural areas. Now, to try to convince you that I'm not entirely crazy, for 25 years, I've been researching real examples of retrofits of suburban form, low-density, parking lot-dominated places, some of which are in cities, but most of which are in suburbia. And my co-author, June Williamson, and I just published our second book on the topic in January, documenting 32 case studies addressing not only issues of public health and equity, but the ongoing pre-pandemic challenges of climate change, competing for jobs, and supporting an aging population. I'm going to zip through just a few of these to give you a little taste of some of the steps that we're already making to build a more sustainable, to sustainably and equitably retrofit our physical world to complement the Tele-Everything world. So job one is still to disrupt automobile dependence. Lots of strategies to do this, shown here in blue. I'm just going to show one case study combining several of these. This is Pike and Rose, a dramatic redevelopment of a 30-acre strip mall into dense, mixed-use, walkable urbanism across from a metro rail station on the 8 to 10 lane Rockville Pike Highway. This is about 17 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And I think you'll agree, it's a pretty dramatic transformation. But that's not all. So I hope you see my cursor. This little northeast triangle, that's the 30-acre strip mall of Pike and Rose. And it's just the first phase of construction of a much larger walkable public street network on 400 acres of private property. And that street network, though, is being paid for by the private property owners in exchange for higher density. Meanwhile, the public sector is putting Rockville Pike, the highway, on a road diet down to 6 lanes with bus rapid transit running down the center to expand access to the metro station. So that's pretty impressive. But even more impressive is this is that 400 acres. They're actually doing an entire 4-mile long retrofit of Rockville Pike into a corridor city, transferring trips from the highway to the transit line. 15% of the units are designated affordable, but the ability to get by without a car will also significantly increase that affordability. And they're doing a great job of making truly attractive, walkable, green streetscapes. So the other obviously really important challenge is improving public health. And there's much we need to do. I'm just going to focus right now on one issue, which is how escalating isolation and chronic loneliness are impacting mental health in suburbia. This project, the Mosaic District, is the redevelopment of a dead cinemaplex into a mixed-use town center with an explicit focus on addressing the loneliness epidemic, primarily by programming the Little Town Green with activities day and night via an LED screen on the side of the new cinema. And they're also doing a number of other things, but it's really quite a fascinating project of how they're really challenging loneliness. We also absolutely must address climate change and lots of one case study. This is Meriden, Connecticut, and the project is Meriden Green, where a suburban shopping mall was built in the downtown working class Meriden, Connecticut, and it was built right on top of a major creek. The pipes failed, caused disastrous repeated flooding of the downtown. Today, the mall's been demolished, the creek has been daylit, and the site is a stormwater park. It's designed a bit like a bathtub, able to temporarily hold all of downtown's increasingly extreme amounts of stormwater. It's removed over 200 downtown properties from the flood zone and now attracted replacement public housing and new market rate housing that have park front views and access to the rebuilt train station. And that all of that gets also into the final challenge I'll show right now, which is leveraging social capital for equity. This one is probably the challenge that is the most threatened by autonomy, online shopping, and tele-everything. Super briefly, we need to combat this by designing and building great public spaces. We need to expand affordability, and we need to add social infrastructure, often through re-inhabiting those existing suburban boxes. This is Plaza Fiesta here in Atlanta, is one of many, many shopping malls that have become ethnic community hubs. In this case, they subdivided one of the junior anchor stores into 140 small stalls and that are now manned by 140 mostly immigrant entrepreneur businesses, and that are really serving the community that had been completely ignored by the chain stores that had been in there previously. Another example here is called Wyandanch Rising. Wyandanch on Long Island was the most economically distressed community there, and it's been revitalized with a great new public space, housing over retail, all on top of the former park and ride lots at its now rebuilt train station. The reinvestment has provided community members with much better access to jobs, access to sewers, and really, for the first time, a great place to have access to each other. So how do these projects happen? You're going to have to read the book. Can projects like these really make a difference? Is there enough funding, enough of a market for retrofitted suburbs for us to be able to avoid the sprawly, wally scenario and really move to a more equitable and sustainable future? I think so. Yesterday, President Biden announced the American Jobs Plan, more colloquially known as his infrastructure bill. In addition to much needed investments in sustainable social, water, energy, and transportation infrastructure, it provides the biggest opportunity yet to overcome the digital divide with massive investments in broadband, so essential to any kind of an equitable future. Now, at the same time, developers are on a shopping spree, buying up the dying shopping malls and aging office parks, preparing to retrofit them. Now is the time for all of us to guide these investments and scale up retrofitting for a much more inclusive future, one that includes and that combines small improvements like sidewalks with the better digital and bigger digital and physical infrastructural moves that will help to reconnect regions. We need, to have this inclusive future, we need a vision that combines all of the advantages of great local communities and valued in-person jobs with access to all of the resources of tele-networks. Together, I believe we can retrofit suburbia to be more just, resilient, and prosperous. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to invite Chris to turn his screen on. I think you've seen enough preaching from me. So Chris, tell me if I'm crazy. I tossed out two pretty extreme visions of where the tele-everything world might take us, and I showed a handful of built retrofits. You've devoted much of your life to data. You've analyzed this country's demographics, the age of our building stock, the quantity of our parking lots. I want to dive into each of those numbers individually, but let's just start with first impressions. Am I crazy?
Yes, you are, of course. I want to thank you for hosting this and putting this together. I want to thank all the people who are participating in this. I see lots of good friends and lots of leaders in this field. You put on a really good program here. I'm happy to be part of it. Yes, you are crazy, but no, you're not. Every great thought is a part of a crazy thought, but it's also part of an emerging truth. I think that if I understood you, there are two broad visions. One is that the dark vision, where all this technology can lead to centralization of the economy and to by and large, or whatever it is that was in that very fun movie, actually, I'd recommend it. I might actually go back and see it again. But I think that, that's one vision. That's certainly a path we could be along. But the other one is, as you spent most of your time on, talking about people, talking about change that's possible, talking about opportunities. I just have so many notes here. I don't know how long you want me to go, an hour and a half or something. But let's just start with two main thoughts I have in mind here. One, COVID-19 accelerated underlying trends. What really happened in COVID-19 in terms of a lot, but not all, but a lot of the things that we saw change would have happened eventually anyway. Zoom, for example, or we're using blue jeans here. So the idea that people could engage, as we are now, with just electronically, and pull it off pretty well on the whole. That's accelerated. I wish I would have bought stock in Zoom, 18 months ago, but it actually peaked in its value last November. It's now sliding downhill. And that's similar with other kinds of stocks. Like I don't know I guess Blue Jeans is owned by Verizon. But anyway, so COVID-19 accelerated many trends that were happening anyway. The retail trend, the telecommunications trend, and other things. But what it also reminds us even more and more is that what is it we miss when we substitute screens for people? Screens only go so far, and we're pressing that, and actually that's a good thing. It's good that we're doing this now. We're pushing the screen to its maximum, utility, but there's something missing. I'd really rather have this conversation. Well, maybe not this one, but I'd would really rather talk with you separately over a beer. You're in Atlanta, I'm in Tucson. That's a problem, of course. So what are the things that COVID-19 has us already thinking about missing? I think that should be sort of put on the table. But the broader themes you're reviewing are things that were happening anyway. It's not the movement to suburbs. Well, there's always been a movement to suburbs. that movement is changing. It's morphing into something a little different. Donald Trump blew it when his campaign was based around assuming all suburban women were like they were when Nixon was running for office in 1968, 1972. But that's not the case. Fairfax County, Virginia, used to be a bastion of very Republican voters, and now it's a bastion of Democratic voters because that largest county in Virginia is now the largest assembly of racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and wealth diversity. So what that leads then is to the rebuilding, the retrofitting of suburbs that you spent so much of your life on, and I've studied the numbers. You're doing the physical rebuild analysis. There is so much opportunity for us to seize the COVID-19 trends to recreate our spaces to do both, to do the tele-everything, but to also be with people. The big downfall of suburbs has been the disengagement of people to themselves. Let's face it, people like to be by themselves, but they also want to be together. Suburbs give us the chance to have one or the other. Downtowns give us a chance to be one or the other. What we need is that middle ground where we can be by ourselves and when we want to be with others with a very short commute, a very short distance. And I don't think that's done by the screen. Maybe sometimes, but I don't think that's sustainable socially. Then there's some other things too. Already we're seeing downtown office demand exploding. Well, the base was reduced, had a lot of vacant spaces, but now we're seeing vacancy rates dropping. Rents are poised to rise because already companies are saying that they have the chance to bring workers back. Jamie Dimon, the famous banker, he wants his workers back in his building like 2 weeks ago, because when people are together in the same space working together, they're more productive. In contrast, when you're working at home, and we know this from studies, people's productivity falls by about up to a quarter, maybe a third, after 6 months. The novelty of working at home wears off. And yes, a lot of people like working at home, and they always did like working at home. I like working at home. You do too. We have jobs that allow us to do that. But for many other people, my guess is most other people, they really are more productive when they're with other people in the same space. These could be engineers, these could be business people, finance people, and so forth. And I have an anecdote actually, at Georgia Tech, a graduate student anecdote. I chaired a master's thesis of a public policy student back in the 1990s, and she was studying the social patterns of software designers in Atlanta. If you could pick any occupation that could work anywhere in the world or the universe, it would be software designers. They're just sit at home, tinker with their code, test their code, and they're done. But no, these software designers were physically locating to live near each other. So they could go to the same coffee shop, go to the same bar, talk about things, share things. So if the one profession that could be the most detached from people wants to be the most attached to people, that's saying something. So I think that COVID-19 allows us a new opportunity to open our eyes up to how can we recreate the suburbs that we have, rebuild the suburbs, reshape the suburbs into something that's more socially desirable. We've always wanted to do that, but now we have a wonderful opportunity. The combination of COVID-19 and the combination perhaps of Biden's infrastructure bill and some other trends going on may give us a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really wholesale engage the economy, engage people, engage developers, public policymakers, and so forth, to reshape, rebuild our suburbs. And that's an opportunity that we need to take advantage of all across the country.
All right, so you're as crazy as I am. Fantastic.
Oh, yeah. Always.
All right, so let's dig into, I mean, again, this issue of what do people want, because I think you really, the software and guys, that really is quite telling. But if we look at broader demographic shifts, market preferences, you've studied these for a long time. The suburbs are popular. Do suburbanites actually want retrofits? What's the future market demand?
That's a really good question. That's on the one hand, we have suburbanites who are the classic NIMBYs, not in my backyard. They like their peace and quiet. They like what they bought into, and they don't want change. But the flip side is that we know from studies and some market analyses that people want to have walkable communities. They want to walk to shops. They want to have homes that are maybe they're detached homes, but smaller homes, smaller yards. They don't want to maintain the yards. So there's a lot of sort of underlying confusion among suburbanites as to what they want and what they're willing to maybe trade off. And I think that's that to me, that's an area that we need to study some more, the behavioral side and so forth. What I'm looking at now is a small growing movement of what's called YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard. Once people see what could be, and assuming they have the chance to buy into what could be as a stakeholder, as a co-designer of the redesign of their own neighborhood, then they say, okay, I like this idea that maybe I could walk to a coffee shop, walk to a restaurant, walk to a convenience store, whatever it is, and they would go to the planning commission or whatnot and say, we want this in our community. And that reminds me, some years ago, I hope I have this right, and I'll apologize to Rick Barnhart if I'm not correct, but Rick Barnhart was the planning director of Nashville-Davidson County back in the 2000 teens. And if I understood him correctly, he told me in a meeting that his staff never goes out to advocate a zone change. He requires the developer to be with the community and come in together for the zone change. That requires the developer and the community to work collaboratively to come up with, identify problems, identify solutions, and walk arm in arm, if you will, to the planning commission meeting saying, yes, we want this. I've always wanted to follow up on how effective that was, but that was his staff policy. So all the zone changes, almost all of them anywhere, were like that. And I think that's an opportunity here behaviorally to go back and see, talk to Rick. Is that true? How did that work out? Is it replicable? Is it done someplace else's, some other places? So I think that's an opportunity that we need to work on. And I learned a lot about that being in several charrettes over my career, not as an activist so much, but as an advisor observer. And once people see opportunities, a store or a coffee shop, they say, well, how do I get from here to there? What's the traffic situation? If they become co-designers of the vision for their community, they typically, not always, but typically become the advocates for that change. So I think we don't do enough of that. And this audience you have, this audience you have today, we're all engaged in this in various ways. So we need to engage. We need to create more participants in the design stage of this. And then lastly, just talk about the big picture. People don't realize this, but I've counted all of the parking spaces in the country. There are more parking spaces in this country owned by commercial property owners than there is land in the state of New Jersey. We know from the emerging driverless cars that roughly a third to half of the supply of parking spaces will not be needed by 2040 or thereabouts. That allows us to unlock vast amounts of real estate value, which then gets to the other point I want to make. We have this preconception that driverless cars will put sprawl on steroids. for a lot of the reasons you raised. We can hop in the driverless car, go any place. We can even drink along the way, all these things, have a party in the car. But I wonder, is that actually going to happen if the marketplace now sees half of all existing parking stalls as surplus, and if we change our zoning and planning to allow the market to respond to it, that's another issue. What's going to happen to those spaces? My guess is they'll be retrofitted, like you're pointing out, into much more vibrant, intense, interactive opportunities for those people who want to have those opportunities. That's not everybody, but I've seen just a study a couple of weeks ago from CCIM magazine, commercial property analysts. They're saying that up to 80% of all adults in the U.S. would like to have the opportunity to live in these mixed environments and even live in a live-work unit in a mixed-use community. 80%, and that's based on surveys they sponsored, not planners, not architects. I wouldn't trust us or you, but these are business people. So there's something going on here, and you're ahead of the curve in a lot of this. We have an opportunity here that we just can't let pass by.
And I love your stats on the parking lots. Of course, I'm from New Jersey, and so it almost is entirely paved. But New Jersey's known as the Garden State, and I mean, to me, it's also do you believe we can truly, if we simply rebuild, low rise, mid rise, not doesn't have to be high rise, but on our existing parking lots, that we don't have to tear down another tree ever again? Do we have that much surplus parking?
I'm waiting for the real estate investment trust that can get into this. There's 80% of all of our commercial spaces are more than 45, are under 2 floors, 1 floor, 2 floors, 80%. 50% of all those spaces, all the commercial spaces are more than 45 years old. All of those low-rise spaces are sitting on a 0.2 or less FAR. And you convert that, that is a tremendous amount of land. That's actually equal to, I did this number, I think it's equal to the state of Oregon or maybe even Montana in terms of total space like this across the U.S. And we know that those commercial spaces are troubled financially because of COVID, but these are long-term trends anyway. What if we were able to buy up these large amounts of underused land? They're flat, they're well drained because they're now, their storm drainage systems usually work. They have the streets, they have the water and sewer available. They're probably over-designed for infrastructure demand anyway, so the infrastructure is already there. All we have to do is add people. And by the way, we know that people want to, not everybody, but a lot of people want to be there. So here's an opportunity to move some low-rise, 2-floor, 3-floor, missing middle housing, if you will, into these 1-acre, 5-acre, 10-acre strip malls, strip centers. Have the retail that makes sense for them locally and the immediate local serving area. Have some offices. And oh, by the way, one of the largest increases in demand for office space is not new buildings, but it's moving into vacant spaces in Class C retail strip malls because the space is there, parking is there, and they have lunch right out the door, walking down to the next door Mexican place or the next door Chinese place or whatever it is. So just accelerate that bud of a trend and retrofit these by the thousands anyway, by the billions of square feet, these suburban retail strip centers into more mixed uses. Now, nobody's done that on a big scale yet, but I'm waiting for the REIT that figures that out, and then they can raise the money that can do this. And by the way, there's a lot of money hanging out there for this kind of opportunity if the right firm can figure out, A, what to do with the marketing, and the design, and then B, how to raise the money. But I'm pretty convinced there's probably up to $1 trillion out there ready to be invested in these kinds of things.
I think we have hundreds and hundreds of strip mall kind of low-rise big box retrofits already in my database, and it is really interesting. I think as soon as you densify, one of the biggest problems they often have is dealing with capturing enough stormwater on site and holding it, and whether the depths of those. But there really are so many. I agree with you. There's just so much potential on that, and I think it's really interesting that actually the project that I showed, the Mosaic District, where that was the former Cinemaplex and now is a sort of movie theater anchored mixed use town center. The company that did that project is Eden's, which is one of the largest owners of grocery anchored strip malls in the country, and this was their kind of beta pilot test to sort of see, if the future is really not in strip malls, let's try out this mixed use thing. Let's see what it's doing. And I think it's also not a coincidence that the CEO, Jody McLean, who herself was when she chose to take the company in this direction, she was sort of top of her game, making tons of money, tons of deals, super busy, and had never been lonelier, and really resonated with women, suburban women, her customers primarily, and understanding how isolated many of them felt, especially the young mothers, who it's just suddenly them and the kid. They moved out to the burbs to be out, have the space, but now the mom is totally disconnected, doesn't really have, and so they all come to the Mosaic District. But kind of part of my point is, that because strip malls haven't been providing that gathering space, they've always been understood as the convenience center. We're seeing lots of strip malls. Phoenix has some really great examples, I think, of strip malls that have become gathering spaces, usually with food, but also I think seeing more of those entrepreneurial businesses going in is really fabulous. We're seeing a lot of different interesting trends around. Wanted to also ask you, Chris, you wrote an article not too long ago forecasting that a senior short sale, I think was what you called it. That basically, the suburbs also have an enormous, most of our aging population are out in the suburbs. That is also where they are contributing to the loneliness. They're often the folks, it's teenagers and it's the folks who can't drive who are most affected by loneliness out in the suburbs. And yet, we still see that as often the choice, that the sort of sense of the dream house for much of our current kind of older generations is that McMansion out in the exurbs. What are you predicting? You've sort of said we've got a glut. There's too many of these, and the next generation won't want them. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you for that segue. The idea is that baby boomers, me, maybe you, I think you're younger than me anyway, but the baby boomers are, most of them have homes, most of them are in the suburbs, as most people are, and most of them will want to sell their homes. I think probably all of them eventually, or they should. And is there a market for their homes when they want to sell? And the baby boomers, let's remind ourselves, we were the largest glut of births in the nation's history, and we're like the pig in the python moving through the demographic cycle. And now we're coming out at the other end with huge volumes of housing that we own, large homes on large lots oftentimes. Are there going to be enough buyers to buy those homes? Now, on the one hand, COVID-19 actually has bailed out some of the seniors who might have been on the market trying to sell their homes, and now we have buyers wanting to buy those homes for almost zero interest rate. So that's actually been a good thing for many seniors. But the thesis is that many seniors, my estimate is roughly 10 million senior households across the country will have no buyers for their homes. Now, it's not Atlanta and it's not Tucson, it's not Phoenix, but it's a lot of other metropolitan and micropolitan and rural areas that simply are not growing. If you look at where the growth centers are in this country, and by the way, when people escape the city because of COVID, they still escape within the same commuting shed of their job. So they're not really going that far away. You know, you have the story that somebody moves from downtown Manhattan to Rochester. Well, that's the story. That's the exception. But the rule is people are moving into Long Island or they're moving into the Hudson Valley, but close, commuting range of their office. What about all the other people who are further away than that? And upriver Hudson or parts of New Jersey or exurbia, far northern exurban Atlanta, Georgia, Rome, Georgia, for example. Is there going to be enough market for younger people to want to buy those homes? My data matched with survey data indicate that's not the case, that there's going to be, I say up to 10 million, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 15 million senior households between now and 2040 that simply won't have buyers for their homes because the buyers are still staying in the large metropolitan areas. They might not want to be downtown anymore because the millennials, they've done their downtown thing, they've done their loft thing. Now they have families, so they want to be in the suburbs. But they don't want to be too far away from downtown. They don't want to be in the exurbs, by and large. Some do, of course. So when you look at the numbers of people in the stagnating, slow-growing metropolitan areas across the country, and even in the robust metropolitan areas like Atlanta in the far exurban fringes, you look at those dynamics going on, and the market strength isn't really there. And that's where the vulnerability is. Now, there's some things we can do to reach out to soften the blow, to maybe do some proactive things to relocate some communities. That's in my article, by the way, but this is not part of that conversation. Now, that said, I do see a kind of silver lining for maybe COVID does allow some households who wouldn't otherwise think so to move into those far-flung exurbs and buy some, McMansions. But maybe they buy McMansions not necessarily for themselves, but maybe they would combine with the friends of themselves or a larger family, extended family, and so you would move into a one-person, two-person occupied McMansion, but now you have maybe 10 people. Maybe it's two families or mother, father, grandparents, or whatever, and some kids. Maybe McMansions, because of the Tele-Everything, maybe they become an opportunity for the larger or multiple households to together decide to move to a large home on a large lot, not too old, but still, fairly close to, accessible anyway, to the downtown. I don't know yet. This is one of those interesting areas of research to follow on after COVID.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to compare the U.S. and other countries and just how in other countries young people tend to still stay in the same community as their parents. There isn't as much of this sense that a young adult will move across the country to a job regardless of where their parents are. And I do wonder whether that Tele-Everything does become that opportunity for families to actually stay closer. We're sort of seeing some patterns of that right now, but I agree. It's one of those let's wait and see. So either both of us are crazy, or maybe we're on to something. There certainly is, your numbers, I think, just show us there's so much potential out there. So what do you think is really going to bring about change? Will it be smart technology, massive federal funding, policy changes, books with case studies in them?
Yeah, you asked that question actually earlier this week, and I've been pondering that. I think that a more proactive federal presence would be helpful, but it can also get in the way. I mean, there's two sides to that. Um, the I guess my sense is we need um, communities that are more nimble to respond to the very fast changing society that we have. Um, on the one hand, our demographics change very slowly. This year looks like last year, next year looks like this year. But in 10 years, we're a vastly changed society, and that's a blink of the eye. And in 10 years, we wake up and we say, how did we miss that? Well, we know these trends. Um, there are probably, I don't know, there are dozens of people across the country that could be brought together to sort of share with policymakers imminent, predictable change in society based on demographic changes. So maybe we need to start with that conversation. How are we going to change in our demographics? A good friend of mine, Dal Myers, a demographer at Southern California, he says, well, economists are always wrong, and we know that. But economists, but demographers are always right. For example, how old will you be 10 years from now? Well, we know that answer, assuming you're alive. But then underlying that answer is, okay, how are your housing choices changing as you get older? What are your consumption patterns? What are your transportation patterns? What is your income? All of these things are influenced by your age and also by your race, ethnicity, parental income, or your income, whatever. We know the underlying forces of change. We just don't convert those into planning, policy, so we can anticipate the change so we're prepared for the downsides and maximize the upsides. We just don't have that conversation in this country or anywhere in the world for that matter.
Oh, that's a great point. Great point. All right. This has been a terrific conversation, Chris. I want to bring Debra in. So, Debra, could you turn your video on? And before Debra, and it goes to the Q&A, and I really want to encourage audience members, please. So, Chris, keep your video on. We're both on we're all three. We should all three be on for the minute. Welcome, Debra. Hi. And I do want to encourage the audience, please post questions in Q&A, and Debra will be moderating that. But before we get into that, Debra, I want to ask both you and Chris to just kind of give some thoughts. What are your thoughts on this question of whether the tele-everything world will usher in more sprawl or more walkable face-to-face urbanism? Which way do you see? Debra, you're really tied into the smart cities, the technology world, how that's influencing planning. Which way do you see things going?
Thank you, Ellen. This has been a fabulous discussion. First of all, I'm just delighted to be here, and you kind of gave me an opportunity just to absorb all this wonderful knowledge and experience. So thank you to you and to Chris for this. The question that you have is obviously a very good one, and I wish I had a more straightforward answer between these binary questions of either or. But the reality is that obviously it's more complicated. I look at it from very much at a leadership level, and what the leadership is looking at in terms of the vision or the problems that they are solving with the community. And so I think you brought a lot of good examples in terms of how technology can address climate change and sprawl and inequality. And if you focus on the problem and think about how technologies like smart cities can be used to address those problems, I think that would produce an alternate realities than what you've painted in that binary sense.
Well, can you describe a little what that alternate? What do you, it's a combination?
So from what I've looked at is very much, where local government and local leadership at government can be a critical force for change and a force for good. And when you have local leaders that are willing to work with the community, to do the tough work of stakeholder engagement and community visioning, and that's willing to put his or her political capital at stake here, and know that a lot of the changes that you're talking about are beyond one electoral cycle. We're talking about infrastructure change that actually goes beyond, and you're not looking at these quick wins where, you could win a popularity contest. So if you have that kind of dedicated leader that is really willing to really think about the community in the long term and really put in the investments in infrastructure, I think that's a critical piece to a lot of this. And I think that's where leadership needs to be, very much connected to experts such as yourself, and helping to provide that vision with critical stakeholder engagement with that. And so, I think of it more as process. And I think if you have strong process in terms of leadership, stakeholder engagement, smart tools, data, as Chris was saying, then I think you will have a stronger outcome. And I think that outcome would be more positive. And then I think, it's a spectrum versus a binary of how positive in one direction versus negative in another direction. And so I would say, just to add more to the conversation, is that often the transformational changes that you've highlighted through your pictures, they take a longer time than we expect. And that means that is an investment that not everyone might have the patience to. We are now at the stage where we are expecting Amazon packages to come within the hour, and we are jumping from Zoom call to Zoom call by the minute. Our immediate response factor in terms of getting things is at a certain norm. And then when we're talking about infrastructure and retrofitting and city development, that takes a much longer time. And so I think it's about managing those expectations and know that you are building a longer term investment, and to be able to engage with stakeholders in that direction.
Very well.
Debra,
well said. Thanks.
Debra makes a really good point, and I want to, and actually your own work with June sort of lead me to something that we don't do enough of, and that is to highlight the good thinking done in the past. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, what decisions were made here locally, you name the city, that led to this wonderful, new, vibrant place. And what if we found a way to communicate that to policymakers, to the press? Oh, by the way, 35 years ago, somebody had the idea of, and here's what's happened. And so it's a way to recognize the courage of the past, but also to stimulate current decision makers to say, well, maybe that could be my legacy too. Yep, and all of these things that Debra was mentioning, and of course you and June, Ellen, are working on, these are decisions that were made decades ago in some cases. And now they're great examples of what can be done. Well, we need to find a way to communicate that and advance that as a legacy worth pursuing by current elected officials, planning commission members, and the public.
Yeah, absolutely. It's why June's and our first book had 5 case studies that we really did a case study. We referenced about 80 projects, but we really only did a deep dive on 5. And this new book is 32 case studies because I absolutely agree. I think there are leaders out there who want to do this, but they don't want to be the very first to try something. They want some backup. They need, there has to be some precedent to be able to show them.
And let me say this too, is I think your case studies help us redefine the American dream and that aspiration. So, I mean, Chris did a really good job explaining, like, before the so-called aspiration or American dream was that suburban cookie cutter development with the garage and the American-made car and the white picket fence surrounding it. And then, you had the newspaper boy, throwing newspapers out in a very linear arterial road, and the nuclear family with 2.5 kids, right? That wasn't necessarily the reality, as we all know, but that was the aspiration. And that aspiration is what kind of built a lot of, this is what's good, and then this is what we should go towards, and then what is not good is not this. And so I would ask both of you, actually, is can you help us think about what the new American dream should be? As in, what would the next kind of development? Is it many types of American dreams, through your case studies, Ellen? Or is there something that we should be advocating for, aspiring for? It's certainly not the white picket fence, suburban house, but what should we be thinking about?
That's a good question. So, from my view perspective, there never was the American dream, but an American dream was advanced, as you noticed, or as you noted. We are so diverse now in this country and becoming even more diverse that we need to recognize multiple American dreams. And that's something that I don't see in the literature so much. And maybe that's a calling for colleagues on the call here or others to start cataloging the multiple American dreams we have and what they are, who advances them, what they want, how they can be served. And a role of government would be to help facilitate that as well, and also informing the private sector about the multiple American dreams. As a matter of fact, my sense is market analysts know what these multiple American dreams are. We need to invite them to share with us what they know, because they don't translate what they know into a planning policy architecture world. So we need to engage that audience as well.
I absolutely agree. And I think the answer is never one single, new, this is now the new product that we're trying to sell everybody on. I think we want to have a very diverse range of living and working choices for people, but we do also have to come together on thinking, recognizing that at least there's equity and there's climate change, and we're addressing climate change. The big common challenges have to be recognized, so that we're not also just allowing folks to sort of say, well, if I'm choosing to do things that will exacerbate those challenges and not in some way have to mitigate the impact. So great question. Great question. We could continue to talk, the three of us, and maybe we will. But Deborah, I see there are some questions in Q&A.
Yes, I will start asking the questions, and I definitely took the moderator's prerogative by asking the first question, but feel free for our audience to keep typing those questions. The first question I will ask is actually from Dean French, and this is a question for Chris, which is, transit systems have been devastated by the pandemic. Do you think transit can recover, or will it be replaced by a combination of TNCs and telework and teleshop and teleother?
Well, good afternoon, Steve. Always asking the very tough questions. I've thought about this a lot. Transit has been devastated. I've seen a lot of articles saying that transit will never recover. I've read a lot of stuff out of New York City, where transit is king. There's a lot of reticence by people to go back to using transit. I think a lot, but not all, of the transit issues will recover over time, and probably sooner than you think. People will still want to be downtown in a year. They'll still use transit. But I think this is also an opportunity for transit planners, providers, policymakers and others to rethink the role of transit in a more multifaceted way. And here again, COVID merely accelerated trends. There was a trend that was not necessarily away from transit, but the trends were not really favoring transit in most metropolitan areas. Certainly there are exceptions. And so one of those emerging trends is, what do we do in a driverless car world where you wouldn't need transit to be in your little car and it'll scoot around networking to get and drop you off, and then it disappears, and then it picks you up when you want to be picked up? Why would you need transit in that environment? That actually goes back to a riff on the Wall-E movie, where you don't even have to walk to transit anymore. You could hail your little car. It comes in, comes by, scoops you up, and off you go. But part of me thinks that, well, you know, the driverless car technology might actually make transit, because we still have congestion effects. One of the models, many of the models I've seen of driverless cars is more congestion, especially closer in. Well, a role of transit would be to take your, the driverless car can take you to stops, take you right up to the platform perhaps, and then you get on the platform, take transit into your downtown or whatever it is. And so we could see possibly the driverless car and transit worlds working together. But that doesn't address Steve's question. Steve's question is, what is the effect of COVID-19 on transit? I think that we could see longer lasting effects on transit than most other activities, because even when people begin working downtowns, as they will, they might be reluctant to use transit because of the myths about transit and acquiring diseases. And here's a factoid that just it doesn't ever get out. Which was the most dangerous place to be to get COVID-19? Public transit or a Trump rally? It turns out your chances of getting COVID-19 were many times higher at a Trump rally than on public transit. And maybe we need to get those kinds of stories out to sort of soften the concerns people have about getting back to transit. And by the way, that was in Scientific American, I think, that article.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of competition in the transit space, because the right now, especially on the autonomy side, the autonomous shuttle bus that's on a dedicated track doesn't have to be able to go anywhere. Those are already able to operate right now, and if we can build the culture for shared rides now, before all the autonomous private cars, which are going to still some time away, I think we've got a chance for that. But the robo-taxi version of the is probably, has a lot going for it, and is maybe the version that wins. We'll see.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So we have another question. Actually, we're going to step outside the U.S. and talk internationally. You probably are familiar. There's a lot of different smart cities projects happening all around the world. One of the most famous is NEOM right now in Saudi Arabia, on the Line project. And just I think the general question is, what do you think about these so-called smart cities projects? The NEOM one is a 100-mile linear urban plan with urban and suburban nodes. As you know, they also are very ambitious in terms of having no personal automobiles and transportation, and really thinking about a high quality of life in the middle of the desert with sustainability aspirations. And it's certainly not the first, as you know, Masdar and others had similar kind of aspirations. So the question is, how does that fit in terms of your thinking about retrofitting and livability and demographics?
I'll jump on that one first. So I always think in terms of retrofitting. That's sort of my first, that's where I go first. And actually, I don't know the line project all that well. I haven't taken a deep dive. But this idea of the corridor city has been around for centuries, literally, at least a century. We've had various versions of it. And I think it's still, there is a lot of logic to it. Most recently, we've had almost any, you look at any of our railroad lines, and those were essentially became a version of corridor cities. We've had lots of variations on the theme. Peter Calthorpe's office came out with a proposal, just hypothetical, but of saying, the housing crisis in San Francisco is enormous. The Silicon Valley, the congestion is terrible. And so he proposed that for 45 miles of El Camino Real, it's just kind of the main spine going through Silicon Valley, that 2 lanes be given over to autonomous little shuttle buses, and you just change the zoning of all the 1- and 2-story strip malls to at least allow mid-rise housing and some mixed use at the ground floor, and you would get that would enable 250,000 new homes at a minimum, without really going dense at all, of homes that wouldn't need to have a car. And these kinds of proposals, I think we need more of them in the U.S. So I'm glad that Saudi Arabia is looking at a project like this, but I don't really know it well enough to really comment much more than that.
Well, I don't know the Saudi Arabia project at all, except that I will say that some countries will take the lead in providing most, if not all, of the capital financing to pull these off. And Saudi Arabia has the capital muscle to pull this off. I'm not even sure the U.S. has the capital muscle to pull that off. So there's the source of money that you have the plan, you might even have the market, but can you pull it off with the capital? I think in the U.S. and in Europe and the rest of the world, we're looking at public-private partnerships. And so the trick is to have a master plan for an area. El Camino Real in California would be a great example. A master plan that attracts the vision of people. They say, well, this makes a lot of sense, and it's limited to this ugly corridor anyway. It makes tons of sense. How do we pull this off financially? And we have designers that can pull it off design-wise. Well, this is where we come up with the public leveraging of private investment. And I'm reminded of Congressman Earl Blumenauer's proposed Rehab Act that was announced last week or 2 weeks ago, that would on a smaller scale do this around TODs, providing tax credits for investors to move into invest in TOD areas. But we need to maybe think even bigger, Saudi Arabia size, if you will, for certain areas in this country where maybe part of this infrastructure money that President Biden is putting together could be, I wouldn't say increase the amount of money, that's a lot of money, but maybe repackage it into leveraging techniques to match the public sector money with private sector money, and create these new corridors in the U.S. El Camino Real is a great one. I've been there, and it's awful. And what an opportunity, though.
Well said. And I would say, in addition to capital, I think Saudi Arabia has a different political governance structure. So it probably wouldn't have the same level of stakeholder engagement that we were talking about previously.
Well, that's a good point.
Another question from our audience is, has there been any data to suggest that Tele-Everything might move jobs comfortably outside our country's borders to other places, reducing the American city population as a whole?
I mean, what I think of right away, and I'll let Chris is the data guy, but I don't know the data on it, but certainly there's been companies that kind of work a 24-hour clock where, so during the day in the US, there's folks are sleeping in Asia, and then they're taking up the work, and a lot of companies, I think, have been relying on labor worldwide through the internet networks mostly, and certainly architects. There are a lot of rendering farms throughout India, China, that U.S. firms rely very heavily on. Sort of, all right, we've done the plan. We're going to bed. You guys do the rendering tonight, we'll wake up. And so some of that's been going on a long time. But whether there's a really bigger scale, I think it becomes really interesting. I mean, to me, it is pretty fascinating to watch the high-tech companies. Isn't it Facebook and Twitter have already, and now Ford have already really said they're going to allow their folks to live anywhere. Those that are not in the factory line, but yeah.
This is a really interesting question. I think to some extent we might have extended this Tele-Everything overseas about to the maximum extent we can. This has been going on for 30 years. Whole law firms actually have been devastated by offshoring just the grunt legal work to India and other places. But that's kind of run its course. It won't stop, but I think the curve is slowing down. I was on the Economic Development Corporation Utah board when I was at University of Utah, and we were surprised with the number of companies that were wanting to reassemble teams from overseas locally in the U.S. because the telecommuting, the teleworking just didn't work for them. And the typical model was that they offshored too much, and so they began reassessing what makes sense offshoring, but what makes sense bringing back to the U.S. certain functions to keep that activity in the office in the U.S. And so I was very curious seeing this almost reverse trend where offshoring was slowing down and maybe reversing among some individual firms. Now, one or two companies doesn't make a trend, but I think that we've sort of seen the maximum curve in the offshoring of this kind of technological related employment. We might even see some of this coming back. And as a matter of fact, I predicted, not that I'm any great soothsayer, back in 2008, that in the 2020s, U.S. policymakers on both sides of the aisle will realize that we need more skilled workers, educated workers in the U.S. than we had supply. And there's only two ways you remedy that. It means you either educate more people so they're smarter, or you import them from overseas. And we're hitting that now. Once COVID is over, once the unemployment is now taken care of in 2 or 3 years, max, by the way, we're going to see a shortage. We already did before COVID, a shortage of skilled, educated workers that companies in the U.S. needed to be in the U.S. That's going to be the future trend that we need to get ahead of and take advantage of.
All right. Well, Ellen, you'll have to help me keep track of time, but we only have like 3 minutes left, and we still have a number of questions. So unfortunately, we're not going to get to all the questions, but I will quickly ask one more for both of you, and then hopefully we can circle back and continue the conversation offline, and those can certainly email you both for more guidance. So the question goes back to our American Dream conversation earlier. The question is, looking from the UK, I wonder if the American Dream will be more European in nature. That is, mixed-use city with, say, 20 minutes walk-in, cycle-in, transit, access to nearly all needs. Well, what do you think in terms of that progression?
Yes.
I mean,
we already see many cities in the U.S. working towards a 15-minute city, and Paris is actually working towards a 15-minute city. Not that we'll ever get there, but there's a lot of things we can do to get to the 20-minute city, 15-minute city, biking, walking, scooters, whatever it is. There's a lot of ways you can get to the 15 or 20-minute city. I think that's actually on the radar screen of most American cities that are thoughtful cities anyway.
All right, well, that was very easy. I will ask you one more that just came, which is, how do we highlight the positive aspects of high density living for children in light of the American dream and parenting?
That's where actually it's interesting to look at the Canadian dream. Canada has had, since the 50s, really built a lot of suburban high-rise towers for families, very family-oriented high-rise living. That is just something that in the US we generally haven't. One of the retrofits in our book is downtown Doral, the retrofit of an office park, and now they've expanded onto a former golf course into a downtown. And they include quite a few high-rise residential buildings that are predominantly serving Venezuelans who are kind of bringing their entire families. And again, very child-oriented. And one of the things that they built, they really are creating a downtown. So they built a new city hall, they built an elementary school, and they made a deal that if it's an excellent school, it's a charter school, bilingual, it has extra hours of teaching, so it's got a long wait list to get in. But if you live in the property, you've got that much more dibs on getting your kid into that school. They've now had to build the middle school, they're now about to build the high school. It's just, so we're seeing kind of the same game that has been the traditional suburban American dream, where schools are what kind of control people's housing choices, but now actually also it being paired with a variety of housing types, including high rises. So,
I don't know how much time we have. I have two examples. Battery Park City in New York City, 30 years ago, now 40 years ago, whatever it is. They designed all the residential assuming no families would want to live there. Well, and initially that's true, singles, couples, but then the singles couples didn't want to leave. They liked it so much. They had children, and they forced the city to give the children the amenities children need. And so they had to plan for new schools in Battery Park City that they never thought they would have to build. Go to the other coast, Portland, Oregon, the Pearl District. The Pearl District was sold to the City Council of Portland, Oregon as a single couple, basically childless living environment. Well, yes, the singles couples moved in. They liked it so much, they had children, and now the city's having to wrestle with creating amenities for the children. This is predictable. This is predictable. So, and then I just finished some studies for DOT that shows that in many metropolitan areas, the largest share of change in households moving next to transit or near transit are households with children. We're missing something here. We just need to open up our minds in planning, architecture, urban design, and policy, recognize families with children want these places to live. Let's make them attractive for them too.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to thank Debra, thank you, Chris, and I am going to just quickly answer one more question on here from Ray Gastile, who asked, do you have any concerns that suburban retrofits will be too successful, especially those that successfully meet the short commute and actually diminish downtown's role as an employment center, and the cascading negatives of that? And I just want to say, this is a topic June and I have really paid a lot of attention to over the 25 years we've been working on suburban retrofits. And no, we're not worried. In all 99.9% of the cases, you don't see suburban redevelopment and densification until the market for urban living has already been proven in the midtown or downtown. It is almost always a twin boom. The one exception, Santana Row in San Jose, and that's a whole separate story, but that actually the retrofit then triggered the redevelopment in downtown San Jose. But it's almost always the other way around. So little comment on that, but I really am so appreciative that I just had a blast here. I love being crazy. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. I just want to offer my sincere gratitude to both Chris Nelson and Debra Lam for for joining me in this conversation, and thank you, listeners, for your terrific questions. I hope everyone has gotten some new ideas about how we can redesign our cities and suburbs. You've been listening to episode 19, Redesigning Cities for a Tele-Everything World. You can catch the video of my presentation on the Redesigning Cities YouTube channel. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, professor in the School of Architecture and director of the Master of Science in Urban Design at Georgia Tech. And see you next time.
Thank you all.
Chris and Deborah, if you want to hang on for a little bit, we can let everyone else go and just still debrief. But if you have to go, that's okay too.
I've got a couple minutes, yeah.
I'm gonna head